Okay, hi everyone. This is Gemara review video number 6, and we are going to look at Rabbeinu Yona, who is an important rabbi from Spain, lived in the 1200s, and an important question that he asks on the Gemara we just learned in Berakhot on Daf Daled Amud Bet, when we were looking at analyzing the opinion of the Chachamim. Okay, so as you remember last time, the Chachamim believe that basically you can really technically say Kriyat Shema all night until Alot HaShachar, until dawn, which is also the opinion of Rabban Gamliel. But the Chachamim made a fence, like an earlier deadline of midnight, of Chatzot, because they were afraid if they let you really have until dawn, you would put off saying Kriyat Shema until last minute, and you wouldn't be able to say it. So they made an earlier deadline. So here's an interesting question that Rabbeinu Yona asks. So he says, we know this is just kind of like a prelude to it. I'm just going to kind of talk about it outside, which we saw in the worksheet as well. So technically, we know Chachamim say you can say Kriyat Shema all night. But here's the question. What if it's after midnight and you did not say Kriyat Shema? It's 2 a.m. I mean, obviously, Chatzot is not always exactly at midnight because Jewish time, halachic time works a little bit differently. But let's just say it's 2 a.m., it's after Chatzot, you get home. You're at sleepover, whatever, you weren't feeling well, you come home, and all of a sudden you realize you haven't said Kriyat Shema. Now, according to the Chachamim, you missed the deadline, right? Deadline was midnight and you didn't say it. But we know that theoretically, technically, the Chachamim say that really the obligation, you really have time until dawn. They just made it earlier so you wouldn't forget. So if it's 2 a.m. and you didn't say Kriyat Shema yet, can you missed the Chacham's earlier deadline, but can you still say it? Though we saw that really striking line at the end of that last Gemara that said if you don't listen to the Chachamim, you're chayav mita, you're deserving of death, which seemed like a very, very harsh statement, which the Gemara will analyze in Gemara review video number 7. But what about this case where it's after midnight, you still didn't say Kriyat Shema? Can you still say it? So to give you an analogy, right, here's the example. Let's say you have a college guidance application due December 1st. Not to stress you guys out, so you don't have to think about college for a while. But your college guidance application is due December 1st, right? But my note wants to make sure you don't, forget to apply to college or leave it last minute. So they're like, you know what? Even though the college's deadline is December 1st, we're going to make a deadline November 1st because we don't want you missing it last minute. Kind of like the Chachamim, right, with making an earlier deadline for Kriyat Shema. But what if it's November 15th and you know what? You missed my note's deadline. Whoops. But you really can still get that application into college because the real deadline was December 1st. So can you still apply? But what if my note says, well, no, we made an earlier deadline and you have to listen to us. And yes, even though theoretically you can hand it in until December, since you missed our deadline, we're not helping you apply to college. Do we say that's the answer? That you always, Chachamim would say, well, too bad, we made an earlier deadline and if you missed it, you missed your chance. That's the ball game. Or do we say, yeah, we know it's not great that you missed the Chacham's deadline or Maya Note's deadline, but since theoretically the college will accept it until December 1st, or theoretically you really still can say Kriyat Shema until dawn, shouldn't we let you get it in? Shouldn't we let you still have the college application in or let you still say Kriyat Shema? So that's the question. That's the question Rabbeinu Yona is going to ask, that would Chachamim still let you fulfill your obligation if it was after Chatzot? Okay. So let's read his question, and we're going to read his answers. Okay, so I'm going to read through kind of the Hebrew. You can follow the English along on the side, right? So yesh la'akshot l'Rabbanan da'amrei afilu b'diavad einu yotze el ad chatzot. Im avar chatzot ma yehedino. Right, so you can challenge the Chachamim who said that even b'diavad, even after the fact, you only fulfill your obligation to say Kriyat Shema until chatzot, until midnight. But if midnight already passed, what's the law? Can you still say it? She'im ne'amar shelo yikra klal kasheh kevan de'Kriyat Shema chiyuv min Torah. Because if you want to say that you can't read Kriyat Shema at all, that's a difficulty because it's a biblical obligation. How can the Chachamim prevent you or exempt you from a biblical obligation if there's still time to do it, right? Meaning, if we're saying you have a Torah command, a biblical obligation to say Kriyat Shema, are Chachamim going to almost stand on their honor so much that they're going to say, well, we made an earlier deadline so you wouldn't miss it, and if you didn't miss it, you have to learn consequences. And you know what? You're going to miss this Torah mitzvah that you could have fulfilled, even though technically you can still fulfill it, because we want to teach you a lesson that you have to keep to earlier deadlines. Like if my note really said, well, you know what? We know you can apply to college till December 1st, but since you missed our deadline, we're going to teach you a lesson. Don't worry, my note would never do this, but we're going to teach you a lesson, and you now don't get to apply to college. Like, we're not going to help you. Like, too bad, you missed our deadline. So what's going to be? So we're going to see two answers. Here's answer number one, Ve'it de'amre. So eat de'amre actually means like yesh lomar, because a tav in Aramaic translates to a shin in Hebrew. So really we're saying yesh lomar. Some say, the svir lahu de'achar chatzot koreo to below brachot. Shebrachot she'enan ela midrabana. Shelo yomar tanachar she'avar ze hazman. Aval kriyat shema shehumina Torah koreo ta kol halayla. So saying some say the Chachamim hold that when the Chachamim would say that after Chatzot you can't read Kriyat Shema, they don't mean you can't read Kriyat Shema at all, but it would mean that if you missed their earlier deadline of Chatzot, you would have to say Kriyat Shema by itself, just the 3 paragraphs, and you couldn't say the Brachot, the blessings that come before Kriyat Shema and after Kriyat Shema. We discussed this a little bit earlier in class. If you look in your Sidur, right, before Kriyat Shema, there's a couple of brachot that we say in the morning, like Avat Olam, right? And different brachot that we say in Ma'ariv before Shema. Then there's other brachot like Emet V'Yatziv or other ones that we say after Shema, either during Shacharit or Ma'ariv before Shemona Esrei, right? So when the Chachamim would say, no, if you miss our deadline, you can't say Kriyat Shema, it doesn't mean you can't actually say Kriyat Shema. It just means you can't say Kriyat Shema with brachot. But Shema, which is a Torah obligation, you can read by itself all night. And what's like the penalty here, this is the end, it says, Afal pi she'ein scharo kol kach, k'moim kara'at b'chartea, afilu hachi yesh lo schar. So you don't get as much like reward for reading it out without the blessings, without the brachot, because like really you're supposed to say Shema with brachot. So it's like you get kind of points off. You know, it's like if you, it's like, you know, sometimes teachers will say like, well, a deadline is Friday, but if you want to hand it on Monday, we're going to lose 5 points. But you can still hand it in and get a grade. You're not going to get a 0, right? So it's kind of what the rabbis are saying. Like, okay, if you missed our deadline, our earlier deadline, since technically you can say Shema until dawn, you can still say Shema, but you can't say it with brachot. That's what they meant when they said you can't say Shema after. You can't say it with brachot, so you're going to get a little less reward, a little less schar, but you technically can still say Shema. And that is our first answer. And now let's look at the second answer. So the second answer is actually pretty surprising. And here Rabbeinu Yona quotes his rabbi, and this was his rabbi's answer. V'nira lemori harav. So this is what the answer was to my teacher, the rabbi. She'afilu kriyat shema atzma shehi min Torah kol halayla, eino koreh ta'achar chatzot. She'yecholim, here I'm sorry, see where I am. She'yecholim chachamim lefpatro mitzvat aseh, kol zman she'osim ken mishum siyag. So very surprising here. And he actually says, no, according to his rabbi's interpretation was, Chachamim would say, if you missed their earlier deadline of midnight and it's like 2 a.m., even though technically it's a biblical command, you can say it all night, you don't say it, you don't read it after Chatzot. Because the Chachamim have the power, when they're creating their rabbinic laws, their rabbinic safeguards, to really uproot a positive Torah command, not like randomly, but only, so let's highlight this over here, it's important, right? As long as they're doing it to create offense, right? Kozman shosim ken mishum siyag, right? Lepatro mitzvah said they have the power to exempt you from positive command, as long as they're doing it to create offense, or it actually continues, right? Or to help you fulfill a mitzvah, right? So meaning, like, they can't just do it because they want to mess you over, but the Chachamim have certain power. Their job as rabbis in making halachot is to make sure, like, sometimes the reason they put in certain fences, certain safeguards, is because they don't want us to miss opportunities to keep Torah commands. Like a famous example, right, would be muktzah, right? Muktzah is when the rabbis made touching certain items on Shabbat forbidden, even though technically according to the Torah, you would be allowed to touch them, because this is, only in certain categories of muktzah, because they're afraid, if I touch my pencil, or if I touch my cell phone, I might come to write with it, I might come to use it. So they added like an extra fence, right? It's almost like, listen, you live near a highway and hopefully you're not going to wander into the highway, but if you have little kids at home, you're going to put a fence up, right? Because you want to make sure that people aren't going to make mistakes, that people aren't going to, by accident, break a law they didn't really want to break, right? And what it's saying over here is the rabbis actually would not allow you. You have to listen to the rabbis. You don't get to say Kriyat Shema after midnight, because as long as they made their law, in order to help you keep a positive command, right? They want you to keep Kriyat Shema. The whole goal was so you'd say it early, so you wouldn't forget, and it's so they can create a fence. Then that uproots the Torah command. So if you miss the rabbinic deadline, that's the ball game. You don't get to kind of say Kriyat Shema later. That would like be saying, since my note's making the rules about college guidance because they want you to write your essay early and not wait till the night before so you can get into a good college, and they did it for that reason. If you miss their deadline, that's the real deadline. Even though technically college was still accepted, the my note deadline would trump that. And if this seems like a little harsh or surprising, they actually give another example, and we'll skip down over here. Here we go, right? We'll kind of read the bottom part. Hachanami afal pi. Oh, sorry. Here, dahachazina belulav. An example it gives is we actually see this happen with lulav, and talks about how technically, according to the Torah, you're supposed to bring the lulav or do netilat lulav. The real mitzvah, according to the Torah, is to do on the first day of Sukkot, right? But if the first day of Sukkot falls on Shabbat, we actually do not bring the lulav on the first day of Sukkot on Shabbat. And this is because the rabbis made a gzeira. They made a rabbinic rule. They made a rule that they don't want you to do netilat lulav on Shabbat, even if it's the first day of Sukkot, because we're nervous. Maybe you live in a town or a place without an Eruv, and what's going to happen? You're not going to go, instead of thinking ahead and going to shul, Friday afternoon and leaving your lulav in shul, so you can do netilat lulav in shul. We're nervous what's going to happen. Once we allow you to touch your lulav on Shabbat, you're going to then carry with it in a Reshut HaRabim, which is a Doraita command. You're not allowed to carry on Shabbat, right, if there's no Eruv. So here, even though the mitzvah of lulav is Doraita, it's biblical on the first day, the rabbis basically canceled it out, right, because, and they had that power because they were doing it in order to help us keep that mitzvah, in order to make a fence. And a parallel would be actually coming up this year on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, the same reason we don't blow shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah if it falls on Shabbat is also the rabbis made a gzeira. They were nervous. If we allow you to blow shofar, you're going to end up carrying the shofar, right? So we actually, and it seems very extreme, right? Like, we're not going to blow the shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which is such a huge part of Rosh Hashanah, because the rabbis were nervous that we come to break this other law. And they have the power to do that, to kind of uproot a Doraita to protect us from keeping that law. And so it ends off, right? Hachanami here too, with Kriyat Shema, it's the same thing. Even though the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema is all night, the Chachamim still can exempt you from it, right? Because they made the earlier deadline in order to create a fence. So this is our second answer. The first answer again is, that we saw in our example was that really you can say Shema after Chatzot, but you don't get to say it with Berakhot. And the second answer, according to Rabbeinu Yona's rabbi, is no, you actually don't get to say it after Chatzot, because if the Chachamim made a law that was for the purpose of a fence or a safeguard, even though it's rabbinic, it kind of knocks out your Torah obligation. And that is what we saw in Rabbeinu Yona.